One of the things I love to do on a Friday night after a long week is tune in to the Two Funny Mamas podcast with hosts Sherry Shepard and Kim Whitley. Now, I got a chance to talk to them one time when they were still on the Tom Joyner Morning Show. And this was fall of 2019, the last season of the Tom Joyner Morning Show. I was on promoting my documentary, Lady Wrestler, about the Black women who integrated pro wrestling back in the 50s. So I love listening to Kim and Sherry and their funny stories. And it just always gives me a little lift at the end of a long week when I'm really exhausted. So in a recent episode of the Two Funny Mamas podcast, Sherry and Kim were talking about this social media backlash that comedian Hasan Minhaj has been getting for apparently being accused of yeasting up or fabricating details about a story in which, when he was in high school, a white girl that he was dating, apparently her mother said that she didn't want Hasan, who's Indian American, to take her daughter to the prom because he's Indian American, he's a brown boy, and she didn't want a person of color in the photos because it might be potentially embarrassing to a family member who might see these photos. Now, apparently, the New Yorker went and did an investigation. I don't know why. I don't know the details of the story because, quite frankly, before I heard about this on the Two Funny Mamas podcast, I had never even heard about this Hasan Minhaj scandal, so to speak. So interestingly enough, after I heard about this story on the Two Funny Mamas podcast, I was scrolling through my YouTube feed, just kind of casually looking for a video to watch. And the Hasan Minhaj explanation of what happened and him deconstructing the New Yorker article came up in my feed, and I was curious. And I realized that I have something in common with Hasan Minhaj. Now, as a writer and a filmmaker, one of the umpteen million projects that I'm working on is a memoir about my experience growing up in an interracial family. I'm African American. Both my parents are Black, but both my parents ended up marrying white people after they broke up. And I have 4 biracial siblings. So the fact that I was raised in this sort of multicultural environment in which I was taught that love conquers all and love is colorblind, I wasn't taught those things explicitly. Neither my mother nor my father told me those things, or my white step-parents didn't tell me those things. I was sort of shown those things by example. So I sort of grew up with this rosy outlook toward the world. And this rosy outlook toward the world resulted from, number one, growing up in an interracial family and seeing that people across color lines could get together and not only date, but marry and have children and build a life together. But also this mindset I had, this sort of looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, was solidified by the fact that my interracial family was never ostracized by society. No one ever shunned us. No one harassed us or picked on us, or family members didn't disown my mother or my father or my step-parents because they married outside of their race. And I grew up going to integrated schools where I was around kids of different races. So I sort of had this, as I said, rosy outlook on the world. But as I listened to Hasan Minhaj's story, I realized that I had had an experience that was similar to his. Now, let me back up and say that when I started writing this memoir about my life, and this is something that I'm just working on in stages, I don't have it in a format that's ready to be published anytime soon. But when I started writing the memoir, I would often tell people about my experiences growing up, how I grew up in this sort of environment where race was really not mentioned ever, and I didn't experience overt racism, because on top of the fact that my family was not ostracized in any way, my interracial family was not ostracized, I, as a Black man in society, it has not been my lived experience that I've been racially profiled a lot. I've not been pulled over by the police a lot just because I'm Black. There was one isolated incident when that happened, when I was pulled over by the police and told that the car I was driving fit the description of a robbery. It was me and another Black guy, a friend of mine who I was helping move. It was a white officer and a Black officer, interestingly enough, who pulled us over. And I simply told the white officer, I want your badge number because I feel like you're harassing me. And the Black officer told the white officer, he has the right to ask for that. You have to give him your badge number. So after I asked for the badge number, they left us alone. So I'm not saying that my experience is typical, or that if you go around with some kind of naive mindset like I had, that you'll never experience racism, or that the racism you experience will be mild. In contrast, what I'm saying is there is no universal experience. When I started writing this memoir, I would tell people that this memoir is probably not going to be that interesting to read because there's not a lot of conflict. I don't have stories like other people who are biracial or who grew up in interracial families have, of not fitting in, or their family being really harassed by others because of they were race mixing. That was not part of my lived experience growing up. And I recently heard comedian Keegan-Michael Key from one of my favorite shows of all time, Key and Peele, the comedy sketch show. He's biracial, as is Jordan Peele, his co-star in that series. And Keegan-Michael Key was on Fresh Air recently, and he said growing up with one Black parent and one white parent, he is what he considers to be bicultural. Now, I am not biracial, but because I grew up in a family where I had white step parents and biracial siblings and grew up going to integrated schools, I definitely consider myself bicultural. I was raised both with my maternal grandparents, my Black grandparents, spent a lot of time around them, so I was immersed in Black culture. But also my mom and my stepfather would take my siblings and I to my stepfather's family in rural Ohio. And we would go to the small town where he grew up for holidays, and his extended white family was very accepting of me and my mom and my siblings. Race was never mentioned. So I do consider myself bicultural. I mean, I'm Black, I'm proud of being Black, but I definitely had an experience of growing up in a bicultural, multicultural environment. But as I started writing the memoir, I realized that, oh, I have experienced racism. And it's not that I had suppressed certain incidents, racist incidents that I had experienced. It's that they just were not top of mind. I don't know if you have ever gone through an old drawer or a storage unit or a garage and started cleaning it out and realized, oh, I forgot I had that. That's how I think our memories function. So it's not that I had suppressed these memories of racist incidents that I had encountered. It's just that they weren't top of mind because they weren't, I hesitate to say they weren't traumatic, but they weren't so intense that they dominated my memory. So one experience that I had was I grew up going to a predominantly white Catholic school up through 8th grade. And my first, I guess you would call her girlfriend, even though we were like 11 or 12 at the time. I don't know if you can call kids that age as boyfriend and girlfriend, but there was this girl named Heather who actually sent me a note. She sort of initiated a relationship, if you will, with me, and said that she liked me and would I consider going with her. And I was flattered, and we quote unquote went together for a few months. And she lived up the street from my house, and I would go after school and visit her. And one day Heather came out of the house and said, "I'm sorry, but you can't come here anymore." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "My babysitter doesn't want you to come here anymore." And I looked in the doorway and saw the babysitter looking at me with an expression of disgust. And even though it wasn't verbalized, I knew that it was about race. The babysitter was actually Spanish, European Spanish from Spain. And what's so interesting is that even though that really hurt my feelings and Heather and I broke up shortly afterward, that experience did not sour me against people of other cultures. In fact, for some reason that I can't quite pinpoint, I became really interested in Latin culture and learning how to speak Spanish. So I've been learning how to speak Spanish for years. In fact, one of the best vacations I've had in recent years, in the summer of 2022, I went to Costa Rica and went to this Spanish immersion school called the School of the World, where you take Spanish classes during the day, and then the rest of the time you have free to kind of walk around the town and go to restaurants and shops and practice your Spanish. So it's interesting that that experience, being shunned or experiencing racism, did not turn me against someone of another culture. I don't know if it's just my nature or because I grew up in an interracial family, so I was used to being around people of other cultures who can, we don't always get along, but it didn't traumatize me to the point where I became racist myself, thankfully. But the experience that I had is probably more similar to the experience that Hasan Minhaj describes is that, and this is another experience that it just occurred to me when I was listening to Hasan Minhaj's video, is that when I was in my 20s in the 90s, a friend of mine, a family friend who happens to be biracial, he introduced me to an Asian girl that he thought that we would make a perfect couple. I went to pick the girl up from her house, and when I pulled up in the driveway, the young woman came out of her house very quick and closed the door behind her and got in the car. And I could tell that the reason why she did that is because I knew she lived with her parents and that she didn't want her parents to see me because I'm Black. And she even said so. She, in so many words, she said, you know, maybe one day when we get to know each other a little bit better, I'll introduce you to my parents. And I could just tell from the way she said it, it was because of race. So my friend thought that this girl and I would hit it off because we're both somewhat shy and reserved, but we just had no chemistry whatsoever. And part of it was cultural and maybe racial, whatever you want to call it. But we just had no chemistry, and we never went out again after that one time that we went out. So it's just interesting, the experience that Hasan Minhaj had and the experiences that I've had, not one, but two that are somewhat similar to the experience that he described. Now, in this polarized environment that we live in, I've heard the question asked, is the average person, and more accurately, is the average American racist? And I would reframe the question in this way: is the average person or the average American a homicidal maniac? Now, the point I'm trying to make is most of us are reasonable human beings. We're not extremely violent, but most of us have had days or an experience where someone was getting on our nerves, or lots of people were getting on our nerves, and we wanted to strangle someone. Does that make us a homicidal maniac? No, of course not. It just means that we're human, and sometimes other human beings tap dance on our last nerve, and we snap and we go off, or whatever. We internalize it. We get stomach cramps, and then we eventually forget about it and move on. So is the average person racist? Well, I don't think you can grow up in American society, even someone like me who was raised to believe, in this kind of kumbaya, we are the world environment, multicultural utopia, you could call it. Even I grew up having racist experiences. Even I have my own biases and my own shortcomings. Another cliche that I hear is that America should not be called a melting pot, as it has been called for decades. It should be called a salad, whereas in a melting pot, all the ingredients sort of blend together and lose their individual components. But in a salad, you have different ingredients that retain their individual components, but they all add to the flavor. Actually, I think American society is more like a stew. I live in Ohio. I'm recording this video in the fall where it's starting to get cold. This is a good time of year to have a good stew. But in a stew, you have different ingredients, but the ingredients all taste like each other. For example, if you have a beef stew, if you take a carrot or a potato out of the beef stew, you're going to be able to taste the meat flavor from the beef. You're going to be able to taste the tomato paste, the pepper, the onions, the other ingredients. So even though the individual ingredients maintain their components, they cannot help but be influenced by each other. In America, we cannot help but be influenced by the racism of decades of slavery and Jim Crow, centuries of slavery and decades of Jim Crow, and the conditioning that people of color are less than. Again, even someone like me who grew up in an interracial family, grew up going to integrated schools, even I internalized some of those messages. I do believe that there is hope. I do believe that we can learn to get along, we can improve race relations, but I don't think that the way that we do that is by denying the existence of race or racism, turning a blind eye to it. I think we have to confront it. So those are just some thoughts that I wanted to share. That was my experience. Again, there is no universal experience. Thank you for watching, and I'd appreciate hearing about your thoughts and your experiences. So leave it in the comments.